I have one thought
Okay.
that I could tell people to do.
Okay, well, we've got 2 hours, so you better stretch that one thought out.
I only have one thought about this movie, and
Yeah.
we're going to hear about it for the next 2 hours.
Sometimes I sit down, I'm like, I really don't have much to say. And then like 2 hours later, I'll be like, and that is what I feel about this.
That's so true, though.
Yeah,
Oh,
really,
man.
really.
Welcome to VCR, Vintage Cinema Rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake.
Isn't chainsaw one word? Is that
Yes?
yeah, is that like, it's funny. So this movie starts with an opening crawl, and then at the end it's like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And like, this is how I know that I'm like too much of a writer. I instantly got on my like Word document, typed in chainsaw. I'm like, no, that's one word. Like, what the hell, guys?
You know what? In my notes here, as I've written the movie down, I actually used one word as well, and I didn't actually notice that it's titled as 2 words. That's hilarious.
Yeah, well, you can tell that's why I'm a writing professor.
Oh, it's super interesting, though, because on the poster itself, it doesn't look like 2 words, but anyway.
Well, that is my note to just get us started.
Okay, fair enough. No, we're talking about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We kind of get a bonus horror movie episode in just because of how our scheduling has worked for the back half of the year.
Pretty much, yeah.
Which is
And
great. This is coming out on October 31st as well, so.
yeah, look at that. And this is what, the 50th anniversary of this movie?
Yeah.
I saw
The
that.
stars have all aligned. The chainsaws have all aligned here.
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So, for those young people of you who are wondering who this Leatherface guy is that you just unlocked in Fortnite, this is where he started.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Can you imagine having, like, a Leatherface chainsaw guy in Fortnite? Like, I can't imagine that they would have that in there, but anything's possible.
No, I'm serious. Leatherface is in Fortnite right
No,
now.
shut
Seriously. I'm not telling stories out of school, sir.
Oh, my God, you're right. That's bananas.
That is bananas. And, you know, it kind of got me thinking, like, when you think of, like, slasher movie villains, what do you think of? You think of, like, Jason
Mike
Voorhees.
Myers.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Freddy Krueger, maybe.
Yeah.
It's funny. I feel like we all kind of know who Leatherface is, but he hasn't quite reached the same horror movie heights as, like, a Voorhees or a Myers or a Krueger, right?
He doesn't feel as culturally relevant or like perma-relevant as the rest of them do. Like he doesn't live in the back of our minds in fear as much. But on the flip side though, like Leatherface is maybe one of the more iconic, one of the like more influential movie villains of all time, right?
Yeah, I mean, we all know who Leatherface is. He's the guy who wears, you know, he's Leatherface, right? Yeah, we kind of know who he is, but like, no, it's funny. Like, I actually, and I'm glad I did this. I watched this movie yesterday knowing basically nothing about it.
Right.
Which is my favorite way to consume any kind of content is blindly.
Yep.
Like, I just kind of wandered in and I'm like, wait, what's going on? Like, I knew a couple things. I knew there was a certain iconic scene that I probably shouldn't talk about in the spoiler-free episode.
Right.
And I know Leatherface was in it. That's really all I knew going in, though.
Yeah, like I didn't know much either, honestly. And that's kind of something I wanted to talk about on the podcast is maybe my relationship to slasher movies and how this is going to kind of fit into that. Like, I was kind of thinking before I watched this, you know, like, I don't know if I'm the biggest slasher fan ever. Like,
No.
I like Halloween as much as the next guy, and John Carpenter is one of my favorite movie directors of all time.
Right.
But I was thinking about it, and I was like, you know what? I have actually seen just about every single first movie in like a popular slasher franchise. Almost every one, except for I can't remember if I've seen Friday the 13th.
Oh, the OG one with
Yeah.
Pamela Voorhees or whatever her
Right.
name is? Yeah.
I don't think I've seen that movie, but I do know the general gist of it. This was my first watch of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but I've seen most of the Halloween movies. I've seen Scream, I've seen Child's Play, I've seen Nightmare on Elm Street,
Mm-hmm.
and I can't even think of like what the other big main ones are. And I've even seen like movies that have been heavily influenced by this, like X and Pearl.
Do you think it's partly a generational thing? Because I almost kind of feel like if you and I were maybe 10 or 15 years older, we would have seen a lot of these
Yes.
movies.
Yeah.
But you and I being born in the early 90s, it almost kind of feels like it's like we were born a little too late for like the golden age of like teen slasher movies.
Yeah, I think that's kind of exactly it, right? But on the flip side, you know, I wouldn't have said that I was a big slasher fan, But thinking about that, thinking about how many of them I've seen, and also thinking about how often I watch these, like generally speaking, I've seen probably one slasher movie a year for the last X amount of years, which to me says that like there's something that every year around Halloween just draws me to these kind of movies.
Okay. If I can speak to my own experience, I don't really think I'm a big horror movie guy in general. There's really only maybe...
You got really into horror movies, though, last year, didn't you?
Yeah, but that was just around Halloween, and I watched a few of them, and, like, I enjoyed them, but they weren't really experiences that, like, really stayed with me.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yep.
Like, actually, I rewatched Scream last October, and, like, enjoyed it, but, like, I can't really tell you what happened in that movie.
Yeah,
now.
I'm kind of the same way with the first Scream movie.
Yeah, and I tried watching one of the Rob Zombie Halloween movies, and I got... maybe halfway through it and just went, yeah, I'm okay. Like, yeah, thanks though. But yeah, so I don't know, but I'm just throwing my cards on the table. I enjoyed this movie a lot more than I thought I would.
Yeah, I think that expectations might be in a weird spot for this movie going in because it's a very iconic film. Like, you know, by the time you're probably 8 years old, you've probably heard of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and because it has a little bit of notoriety around it.
Well, I mean, what a title. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, even if it is grammatically incorrect. Like,
yeah, for sure. And so, you know, it's a movie that's maybe lived on in the zeitgeist, as you will, for a long time. And so I didn't know what to expect with this one. Like, you know, it's a movie from the 70s. It's a slasher movie that kicked off the slasher craze of the 70s and into the 80s as well, right?
Well, that's kind of the other thing I didn't really know about this movie going into it, is that it's kind of like the proto slasher movie.
Yeah.
I always kind of assumed John Carpenter's Halloween was kind of like, you know, the distant ancestor of all these movies, but this one predates it by like what, 5 years?
Yeah, 4 years, 5 years, something like that.
Yeah, so I mean, you gotta respect the hustle there.
Well,
but...
and even like comparing movies and where they've come and where they've gone, like, yeah, a lot of movies have come from this, but even like the movie Psycho is technically a slasher movie in a sense, right?
Yeah, that's true too. Psycho is kind of like the real OG.
Yeah,
right?
but even this, like, you know, Psycho was kind of doing one thing and it didn't. I don't know that Psycho. I actually haven't seen Psycho. That's maybe the only other slasher movie I haven't really seen.
Okay.
Which we need to do at some point because obviously that's a massive hole in my filmography.
I mean,
watching.
It's Psycho. Yeah, I haven't seen it in 12 years probably.
With Psycho, I don't know that they were able to show the kind of violence that was shown in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So
I guess maybe that's something we should talk about. After watching this movie, I did a little digging, and I guess you know, Leatherface, Norman Bates, and I think a couple other famous, you know, movie monsters were all inspired by one real life serial killer.
Ed Gein.
Mr. Ed Gein.
Yeah.
Imagine you're so evil that like two of the most iconic movie villains are based off you. Right?
Yeah. I think we'll talk about that maybe more in the spoiler episode. But yeah, do be aware that like, well, this movie pegs itself as a true story based on true events and everything. And that's maybe the other thing that's iconic about this film is I don't know if there's many other films that come before this that pitch themselves, market themselves as based on a true story when in all actuality, they're not. Like maybe they're like based on people or events that happened, but like very, very loosely. But that's something that's happened over the last 50 years. We've seen movies like Fargo do it.
Yeah.
Blair Witch Project. Like lots of famous movies have kind of taken this on, but this is, I think, the first case of that as well.
The Coen brothers, they were interviewed about that, and I think they said something effective like, oh, it's our movie. We can put whatever we want at the beginning, right? Yeah. So...
And even like the opening of this, right, where it talks about, you know, this is based on true events and everything, like knowing 50 years later, knowing that this is obviously not based on like a real story or a real day in somebody's life, like there's still something that like it just kind of in the back of your mind still messes with you a little bit at the beginning.
I guess it's because a lot of the things that happen in this movie are fictional but plausible.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like plausible,
right? And I think it kind of goes back to the primal fear, and like this is getting into a little bit like who this movie is for, and we haven't even gotten into the plot really yet, but I think us growing up in a small town and being in a rural area, and you know, you spend a lot of time out driving through farmland and like out in the boonies,
just the big empty,
and just like you never know what's happening out in the world kind of thing, right? And the world can be a scary place, especially in quieter areas of it.
Yeah, really, especially in the deep south, right? I was kind of watching this movie like, okay, it's playing on our primal fear of hillbillies,
Right.
essentially.
Yeah, a little bit. Yep.
I feel like there was, maybe I'm telling stories out of school here, but it feels like, especially in the early 2000s, there was a lot of, like, for lack of a better term, hillbilly horror movies.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I'm like watching this movie, I'm like, okay, this is like the progenitor of all that.
Well, yeah, and again, this movie is so influential to the last 50 years of filmmaking that it's hard not to make a comparison to it when it incorporates like a slasher element or like, you know, the backwoods horror element or something like that kind of thing, right? Like it's really hard not to just immediately go back to this one. It's also impressive at how well this movie holds up.
Really? Yeah. I mean, there's a couple things that I thought that are definitely dated.
Yeah.
But like, considering this is a 50-year-old movie, it's aging really well.
Yeah. A 50-year-old micro budget movie.
Yeah. And like more on like, you know, if you think the movie's scary, you should hear about the filming conditions.
Oh my God. I can't wait to talk about some of that.
Yeah.
So let's get into the plot a little bit before we wrap up our primer episode that we've been on a nice long tangent about.
Yeah, we do love our tangents, don't we?
Yeah.
So, the film, which you are about to see, is an account of the tragedy which befell a group of 5 youths, in particular Sally Hardesty and her invalid brother Franklin. So basically, the movie opens with that quite iconic text crawl, which we find out, you know, if you do any research, is completely untrue, but that's okay.
Right.
Basically, what's happening is a cemetery has been struck by a plague of grave robbers.
Right.
And a bunch of corpses have been illegally exhumed. And
even there was one that kind of got left as like this weird
like offering kind of thing. Yeah. And like that's how the movie opens. And like what a weird, chilling opening that is.
Yeah. And then even after that too, like, and we'll talk about this in the deep dive, but there's something about the way that this movie opens and just how it is completely focused on just some imagery. And while like all of that's kind of happening, we get like this radio talking about the news at this point. There's something deeply unsettling about that.
It's hard to even put your finger on, but yeah, it opens with a radio broadcast explaining the grave robberings. And there's all these like weird close-up shots of like a dead armadillo at the side of the road and like a corpse that, like you said, has been exhumed and then like kind of tampered with almost. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So the other thing that's I think really interesting about this movie is it's kind of in a genre of like people just wrong place at the wrong time kind of thing. Like these people, none of them, and we could talk maybe about in the deep dive whether anybody deserved it or not kind of thing, right? But it's not like, you know, these are horrible people who have done something bad and are being avenged upon by some angry spirit or something like that, right? Like these people are just on their way to go see an old family home.
Well, they're essentially, they're going to see an old family home, and they're sort of just, they want to check on their relatives, right?
Right.
Can you imagine how unsettling that would be if like you found out that like the cemetery that dear old dad has been buried at has been tampered with?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, you would at least take the day off work.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. I don't know why I said it like that. But no, I stand by that. So then we meet Sally and her shit friends. And yeah, basically that's the plot. They're heading to check on their relatives. And, you know, they're going to go visit an old family home.
And they happen upon something horrific.
It turns out these 5 people all have the worst luck in the universe, right?
The worst luck, but also some of the worst sensibilities ever.
Yeah.
And more on that when we get into the deep dive, too.
Yeah, well, it's funny. So one of Sally's friends, I was just calling her Girl B for the whole movie. Her name's Pam.
Yeah.
She's reading from, like, a book of astrology, and she... You know, there's different points where he's like, oh, well, like, Saturn is a blockage right now, and, like, blah, 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 right? And, you know, all that weird stuff. I want to also say, you know, just jumping forward a bit, like, this movie is incredibly intelligently written.
Yes.
Especially, I hate to say it, especially for a horror movie.
Yes.
You know, there's a lot of, like, small thematic things that tie in together, right?
Right.
Like, this is not a dumb movie. Someone put a lot of thought into, like, the dialogue and all that stuff.
Yeah, and I also genuinely was impressed by that. Like, it was something that I wasn't expecting going into this movie, especially with my history of slasher movies and seeing a lot of the slasher movies. Like, some of them don't have the best writing necessarily, but maybe have iconic kills or something like that. But
yeah,
I was genuinely impressed, and there was, like, decisions that were made as well with some characters where I was like, make me feel one thing and then do something else with a character that I think we're going to have a lot of fun talking about in the spoiler full episode. You know, the other thing that's really interesting about how this movie is made is usually when we talk about characters and people you may know, there's usually at least one person where it's like, oh, if you've seen this person in the last 20 years and you like them as an actor, then you might enjoy this movie because they're also doing a cool performance in this. This is a bunch of unknown actors who are all from like local Texas that they just hired to do this movie. Most of them didn't really go on to do a whole lot else after this. Like, I don't really have many people to talk about performance-wise. And that adds to some of the like believability of this movie.
Yeah, like the realism, right?
Right.
It's not like it's like Nicolas Cage, and you're like, oh look, it's Nicolas Cage, right?
Yeah, and there's no plot armor with any of the characters.
No, there isn't.
So yeah, it's there's something magical about seeing a movie like this, and it kind of got me thinking, like, could this movie get made to the same degree of writing and stuff, and you had like a bunch of famous actors in it? Like, what if you put Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt and, let's just keep it on that generation, Julia Roberts and Sandra Bullock in this movie as the four characters?
See, here's the thing. I don't think any of those famous actors would have signed on to this movie because our 5 main characters are quite underwritten.
Yeah.
And I would point to that as a flaw of the movie, but it almost kind of adds something.
I kind of like when horror movies do that, though, like when they just decide, okay, well, let's not give a whole big long backstory into these characters. Let's just drop you off where these characters are at this point in time, and the unknown, the mystique of these characters kind of adds something to it, because you have no idea what these characters, maybe their motives are or anything like it. There's a point in time when I was questioning whether maybe one of these characters was involved in something like this.
You know, there's no scene where like, yeah, they have a monologue about their past, or like there's no like cute scene where like the writer tries to make you like these characters. It's just, these are 5 people and they're heading into like the arms of the devil. I don't know, right?
And it's like the way it's shot too, it's like almost subjective as well. Like, you know, you're not made to like or dislike any of these characters necessarily for the first 30 minutes or so.
Not particularly. There is one character in particular that we do have to talk about, and I think you know who that is.
Yes,
but
probably.
We'll save that for next week.
Yeah, for sure. And so, you know, like, we've got our 5 main characters, Sally, Jerry, Kirk, Pam, and Franklin. But in addition to that, like, Leatherface obviously is very relevant in this movie. There's a hitchhiker in the first like 30 minutes of this movie, and that's maybe like the most upset that I was the entire movie was the hitchhiker scene. I was gonna
say, okay, so like this isn't really a spoiler, but in the first 10-15 minutes, they pick up this weird guy.
Yeah.
It's honestly like one of the most, like, I was almost getting nauseous watching this scene.
Yeah.
There is something about it that just like, you're just like, oh no, oh God, right?
I was in the scene watching it, and my jaw was kind of on the floor, and it took me, while I was watching the scene, I thought to myself, think about how you're reacting right now to this, because I had kind of like, had stepped away from me being on a couch where I was to me being in the van with them.
You were immersed.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was very immersed in the first 15 minutes of the movie when the hitchhiker hops in the van.
Well, again, we'll talk more about this in the spoiler episode, but like, I think it works so well because we've all had an experience where you're stuck in a social situation with someone that you suspect is a little unhinged. Right?
Yeah.
Right. Now, I normally am that unhinged person for most people, but
yeah. Oh,
yeah,
man. But it is something, though. It is, to me, surprised me the most about this movie because, again, you think of, if you know any of the other horror movies, and like especially if you get into like some of the later editions, it really just becomes about the iconic villain, like the Leatherface or like the Mike Myers kind of thing, and it gets to become more about the kills and like how is this character going to kill creatively. And in this case, like, I was surprised at how scared I was by just a hitchhiker sitting in a van full of people.
Yeah, that too. And like, to be fair, the and other people have talked about this, but like, this movie isn't actually all that graphic when you get down to it.
Right.
And the kills that do happen are so blunt, pun intended, and matter of fact that it almost makes it worse.
Yeah.
There's a big iconic kill that happens like maybe halfway through the movie where it's so abrupt and so sudden that you're a little like, oh.
Yeah. It's pretty wild.
I wanted to say before I forgot, like, All the actors are on point in this movie.
Yes. They all feel like real people. And even like, I want to say Sally, the main character, like there are genuinely points in this movie where I was like, I think she might be actually running for her life right now.
Everybody, and it's funny, you watch a lot of these old movies, sometimes the actors are a little too vaudeville-y, but like, maybe it's because a lot of these people maybe weren't super trained actors, but like it just seems there's something incredibly naturalistic about it, you know?
Yeah. Definitely. They're not thinking too hard about their lines or how to say them at all.
Yeah, like actually, I think one of the reasons why the hitchhiker scene is so terrifying is because I was watching that scene and I was like, this guy's incredible.
Yeah.
Like, is this a literal lunatic that they threw on camera? Like,
he kind of looks like James Franco too. I don't know.
A little bit. That makes it even worse.
Yeah, it really does, honestly.
Yeah.
I don't really have any actors to talk about, like, name drops for that, but the director Tobe Hooper I thought was really interesting. Like, he did this, and this was kind of the movie that put him on the map, but he also directed Poltergeist, which is...
I looked into that too, and I guess it's funny, his career suffered because everyone just assumed Steven Spielberg directed that movie.
Yeah, I thought he did too. I actually have Poltergeist upstairs. I haven't watched it yet.
We should watch it.
Yeah, it's in my big DVD set.
I really want to watch it now. And also, how fucking sad is that? That, like, you make an iconic movie, but because a more famous person produced it, everyone just credits it to him?
Yeah, well, Steven Spielberg wrote it.
Oh, did he? I thought he just produced it.
No, he wrote it as well.
Oh, okay. It kind of reminds me of how... everybody assumes Tim Burton directed A Nightmare Before Christmas, but he just produced it.
Right.
And I don't even know the name of the director off the top of my head.
I don't actually know either, because I always cite Nightmare on Elm Street as my favorite Tim Burton movie, and I always forget that fact.
Yeah. A Nightmare Before Christmas?
Nightmare Before Christmas, sorry. Yeah.
Right. All good.
There's a lot of nightmares in a lot of places.
Yeah, well, what can you do?
But he also directed 2 episodes of the 1979 miniseries Salem's Lot, which is probably considered one of the better series or renditions of Salem's Lot.
One of the better. You know what? We should create a separate podcast based on all the like weird miniseries that were
man, I would have so much fun
produced
doing that.
about Stephen King's work, especially the ones pre-2000s that were all kind of shitty.
Apparently, there's like a 4-hour cut of Needful Things that is phenomenal.
Really?
Yes. And I've been like kind of eyeing it as something. I don't know that we do this for the podcast, or maybe you and I just sit down for 4 hours and watch it.
Yeah,
once
again, people, me and Blake are actually friends. We do hang out outside the podcast.
But only when we have to.
Yeah, really. It's like, hello. only when our counselor encourages us to.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, no, I'm kind of interested in that, but that's a random tangent for another day. Maybe that's what we do, is we do a Stephen King miniseries podcast next year, and we just watch these miniseries throughout the year and then do our top like 5 Stephen King miniseries or something.
Can I confess something to you that I'm just remembering now?
What?
Okay, so you and I both read It.
Yes.
When we were like, I think I was like 16 and you were 15.
Yep.
And then my parents bought me a DVD of the 1990s miniseries, right? And you and I promised that we would watch it together. I watched it by myself because I was too excited, and then I watched it again with you. But I pretended it was my first time seeing it because I didn't want to upset you.
That's great.
Yeah, and now that confession is recorded forever in the annals.
I don't even remember watching it, to be honest.
Okay, then I retract my apology. I think even at 16, I was like, this isn't that great.
Yeah, it was a little hokey. It definitely doesn't necessarily hold up. I think it holds up in a lot of like maybe the boomer generation's mentality, because they were at like an age and it was at a time when it came out that it was just spooky enough that like, and you know, they were just connected with their childhoods still at that point.
Maybe something like that. Yeah.
Because that's kind of what the Stephen King like It book does. And this is such a tangent, so I'm going to keep this short, but it kind of like preys on your childhood memories.
Yeah, and Stephen King in general really does that a lot.
Yeah, and he does it more effective than a lot of other people do, I think. Anyway, getting back to this movie, Tobe Hooper also directed a movie called Life Force, which is about space vampires, and it's been on my list to watch for a very long time, and it just moved up on the list to watch. So
okay, I did check out his filmography. His most recent movie was 2012.
Yeah, I think he passed away like after that, though.
Oh, that's right. He passed away in 2016. 2017, I think.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, that's too bad.
So we're not getting more from him, but he does have an interesting filmography out there that I am interested in exploring.
Okay. It's a shame. I feel like maybe his career didn't quite reach the heights that it should have.
Yeah.
But he did have some bangers.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. This being, again, if you make one of the most iconic movies of all time of a certain genre, like, you're going to be remembered.
Well, it's funny. Like, I've often kind of thought, like, sometimes I worry, like, what if I'm just a one-trick pony? But then I think about it, I'm like, most people are like a zero-trick pony.
Yeah,
so,
that's
like,
so true.
Yeah,
That's so true.
I'd be totally okay with that.
Yeah, that is actually a critical piece in, like, the idea of the one-hit wonder mentality, right? Like, sometimes just one absolute banger is all you need.
Yeah, there you go. Let that be a lesson to you folks at home. You just need one banger.
So who is this movie for? Does it hold up? Like, we kind of did already talk about how surprising it is that it holds up, but I think this is kind of a horror movie fan must watch at some point in your life.
Well, see, I'm not really a horror movie fan, and I still really got a lot out of it.
Yeah, it's surprising, like, how good this movie is and how well it holds up. Like, and I think that part of why it holds up is because it's shot using, like, maybe an older style filmmaking style. Like, it's almost like documentary style in a sense, like, and it's kind of grainy, like, it's not,
It's kind of grimy looking.
yeah, and it's like, it's not digitally made because this is way before digital movies. But I think that if you were to make this movie today using the exact same script and the exact same like people, but they were frozen in time, whatever, and you made this like digitally on an iPhone or something like that, and it kind of had that filter to it that's like, like it looks almost
like a
more
sepia
real
tone kind of thing.
Yeah, or like almost more real on the screen than it is in real life kind of thing. I don't know if it would be as memorable or as good. There's something about that griminess on even just like in every shot that adds something to this movie.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you couldn't make this movie nowadays because, okay, slight spoiler, there's a scene later on where someone says, call the police. They're like, I can't, the phone is down. If this were shot in like 2024, you'd be streaming Leatherface coming at you on your phone for all your followers.
But I think that
and then you do a TikTok dance with him.
I think that also, though, like a movie that is kind of preying on these kind of slasher fears also is served best in the 70s, like post all of this serial killer craze and like all of the Ed Gein, and I don't remember what Bundy's first name, Ted Bundy,
yeah.
And like, all of those serial killers were most active, I think, in the 60s and the early 70s.
I guess the other thing, sorry to cut you off, the other thing is this was before the genre really was codified.
Yeah.
So this would have felt incredibly novel and interesting in 1974. It's still novel and interesting in 2024, but like 50 years ago, I actually watched this movie on YouTube. Somebody uploaded the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And, like, I think somebody had commented that they saw it in theaters and, like, they almost walked out of the movie.
Right.
Like, that's how upsetting it was.
I believe that, and I know that there was reading online that there was a lot of walkouts on this, and even in, like, the test audiences, there were walkouts to it because it is, like, generally speaking, probably one of the more upsetting movies I've seen this year.
Yeah, and I loved it.
I did really enjoy it as well. If you're a fan of the slasher genre, like I said, I've seen a lot of slasher movies and like the most iconic ones, and it's somehow this movie felt fresher than most of those movies did after my first watch. Like I was surprised, like I was not underwhelmed by this at all.
Yeah, this is one of those like pleasant surprises in cinemas where like sometimes you go back and you watch an old movie and my go-to line is always, I admired it more so than I enjoyed it.
Right.
This one I both admired and really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and there's also some really interesting twists and turns and I think that's also part of the plus to this movie is like we've talked about how the first 20 minutes in the hitchhiker scene are like some of the best, like, that's maybe one of the scariest scenes of a movie I've seen this year. And because this movie, it has Leatherface, and Leatherface goes on to be such an iconic character, that there's a lot of other stuff in this movie that I didn't expect. There's something that's really twisted and weird that gets like happens later in the movie that I was like so like shocked by that, this movie's going to surprise you.
Yeah.
And it's not going to follow like some similar trajectories that you've seen in other films before.
We were talking earlier about how like maybe Leatherface hasn't quite reached the same peaks as like Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees or Freddy Krueger. I almost think maybe that works to this movie's favor.
Yeah.
Because I went in knowing nothing about this series, and like, you know, I'm sure we'll talk about it more next week, but like, I'd never seen, like, for instance, there was never ever any like Leatherface versus Jason or like Leatherface versus Freddy, right? Like, you know, I was able to take this monster a lot more seriously because he hasn't become this like weird pop culture fixation. Right?
I think because the character is almost so anonymous, that he's kind of invaded our culture in ways that we couldn't have anticipated. Like, you know, if you go to a haunted maze, for example, and there's obviously at some point in 99% of haunted mazes is going to be a chainsaw guy. Well, that's going to be pulled from this movie.
Pretty much, yeah.
Like I said, X and Pearl are definitely inspired by this movie. Like House of a Thousand Corpses is inspired by this movie. There's just like so many elements of Leatherface that is become iconic without it feeling almost like overdone, or like, you know, we need to go back to the well to like see what Leatherface is up to now, or how he's going to kill in a different way now. Like, the character is almost a little surprising too in how he's written as like a blank slate in a way. Like there's not anything inside of the mask, really.
Essentially, no.
All of this is really appealing in a surprising way.
Yeah.
Coming at this movie 50 years later.
Yeah, exactly, right? Although he is on Fortnite now, so I mean, maybe that will take away some of the mystique. But yeah.
I didn't have a one scene to sell in the movie because Movie Clips surprisingly doesn't have any of the scenes online, and maybe that's not surprising. Maybe this is too. Some of these scenes are like too upsetting for YouTube.
For YouTube, yeah.
You know, I think that for me, if you watch the first 5 minutes of the movie, like if you go to the YouTube, like the full version of it, or even like I've seen clips of like the crawl, like I'm talking like the first actual 5 minutes, the opening crawl, and then the credits where the radio kind of rolls out. If that doesn't unsettle you, if you're not even just a little bit intrigued, this movie might not be for you. But I think that enough, like with the crawl and everything, I just kind of instantaneously was kind of leaning forward and like fully like ready to let this movie kind of wash over me.
Yeah, you're like, what the hell is all this?
Yeah.
I would maybe say, if, you know, it hasn't been taken down yet, if you can find that full movie on YouTube, maybe watch the first 15 minutes. Because I think the hitchhiker scene is really what got me.
I agree. That scene's, like I said, one of the scariest scenes I've ever seen.
Yeah, absolutely. And how impressive is it that, like, 50 years later, for how desensitized we are, it's still, that scene is still so potent and so effective.
Yeah, for sure. So when to watch? For me, this is a late night movie. This is a Friday night, late night movie. It's perfect for that time slot. It
pops.
Yeah, it really pops on. It's 83 minutes, which is also like a huge plus for me for my late night movies. I like something that's short and quick and to the point. And it's so good. Like, it's so goddamn good.
I almost feel like if this movie were any longer, like if this movie were 5 minutes longer, I would be like, take those 5 minutes out.
Yeah.
You know, like, get out of here.
It doesn't overstay its welcome by any means.
Yeah. No
and there's
kidding.
never even like a scene in this movie where I'm like, okay, let's move on to the next thing. You know, like I was just kind of along for the ride the whole time.
Yeah, it's tight. Like Toiga.
Where to watch? It's on Tubi right now. That's where I watched it. And it was great.
Okay. I watched
happy.
it on YouTube. Somebody actually uploaded the whole thing with captions.
Nice.
And you know how I love my captions.
Well, Tubi has captions too. And ads, but it's free.
Ah.
So that's pretty sick. And it still supports, I guess, the people who made it. So.
Okay, yeah. Interesting.
I love Tubi. I probably said this already, but Tubi is like it's become probably my favorite place to find movies because it doesn't have all the blockbuster movies or like the biggest movies, but it has just some weird shit on it and like stuff that you're just not going to find anywhere else. But if you're like a big movie like aficionado, that's the place to go, honestly.
You know what Tubi is? It's like your weird uncle who never got married and never had kids, but he always asked the coolest shit.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Like he's got a little man cave with all these weird movies you've never seen.
That's exactly what it is. 100%. The other analogy I would say is it's like the 7-Eleven variety store, like back of the store kind of movie rental, and you'd already seen all of like the best big stuff usually. You'd
have to walk through like a string of beads to get there.
Yeah. And then you would find these like weird movies that you'd never heard of before, but like either, you know, the title caught you or like the box caught you or something like that, and you'd go home and watch it, and sometimes they would be horrible and sometimes they would be fun. And
horrible in a good way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And this in this case would be like one of those movies that would kind of shock and surprise you at how well it's held up.
Shock and awe. Yeah.
And otherwise, I think that's it for the primer episode. Like, you and I have hyped this movie quite a bit, I think. We're both on the same page on this one.
I'm actually really excited to get to next week's episode because I have a lot to say.
Yeah, so do I. So let's wrap this one up and move on to next week.
Next week.
So we'll see you next time. Tell your dad about this one because he's going to enjoy this one, I think.
Depends on your dad. My dad would have crossed his arms and walked out of the room if this movie was put on.
Fair enough. Yeah. He might have been a generation above who this movie would be targeted at.
Although, I don't know, though. He might have surprised me.
Yeah.
Blake and I were just talking before we started recording about how, in the past, my barometer for a film's quality was if my dad could stay awake.
Yeah.
You know what? He probably would have stayed awake throughout this movie.
I think this movie would be hard to fall asleep to.
Yeah. Actually, maybe...
And if you can fall asleep to this movie, you might need to get checked out.
Actually, you know what? For the young women listening to this podcast, if there's a guy you're not sure about, put this movie on and see if he falls asleep.
Yes. Or if he's like really happy the whole time and excited, and he's like, oh my God, that was so fun.
So what you're looking for is this like sweet spot of like awake but kind of disgusted.
Yeah, awake and upset.
Yeah.
That's what I was the whole time. Awake and upset watching this movie.
Awake and upset. All right.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.